a research paper is like a movie in a sense. So you go to the cinema, you watch the trailers of the upcoming films, and there's usually one that hooks you in, and you think, God, that looks great, that. And then you go a few weeks later, and it's absolutely diabolical, and you think, why the hell did I pay me money for that? And it's exactly the same with research papers, and that's what an abstract is. It's a brief trailer of what that study is. And one thing I've noticed the last few years is because there's this almost competition to create positive findings and big findings and, big storylines, authors do almost amp up what they're actually reporting. As I said on the post the other day, it's then a case of, well, once you delve into that, in terms of the methodology and the results of it, you look at the abstract and you compare and you think to yourself, actually, those two things don't quite mirror up. And I think that's probably, where people just read the abstract, they then go away and then even maybe implement it in the practice or shout about it on LinkedIn, whatever it might be. And that's, for me, quite a big issue.
Hey everybody, and welcome back to another edition of the Physiotutors podcast. Today we have with us James Malone, a sports scientist, a researcher and senior lecturer at Liverpool Hope University, program manager, if I'm not mistaken as well. Look, James, that is literally a 10-second brushstroke into your name. Why don't you maybe take 2 minutes, introduce us to yourself, tell us a little bit about what it is that you do and what you have been doing over the last couple of decades, and yeah, we'll dive on into research.
Yeah, sure. Thanks for having me on, Sonny. I guess so. This is my 7th year in academia now, so I still consider myself relatively relatively young, even though the grey beard probably is not helping me at the moment. But yeah, sort of prior to academia, I did spend a lot of time working in performance sports. So back in sort of 2010, I did my PhD at Liverpool, where I worked full time at Liverpool Football Club. Also did the PhD full time, which is why I've got a grey beard, to be honest, because it's not easy.
Doubles up,
Yeah. Spent a bit of time in the commercial world as well at Catapult Sports GPS company, which was fantastic. Got to basically travel around Europe for 3.5 years, meeting loads of people every week, flying out to a different country, which sounds great, but after a while it does take it out of you, to be honest. And yeah, I kind of moved into academia, always been into the research side of things, from the PhD and back to my master's days as well. And I guess for me, it was a bit of a more of a balance in that, because working in performance sport is extremely hard and it's a lot of hours in the week. And for me, long term, I think academia provides that nice balance going forward.
Okay, lovely. And as you mentioned there, you're steeped in the research world, and that's kind of what's led us here today. So you posted something on LinkedIn with regards to understanding research, and the thing that first caught my eye when I was doom scrolling through my LinkedIn was the fact that it said don't stop at the abstract, which I almost did and then fully read your post. And it sparked something in me, and this is a continual conversation I have with students when they come through the door on placements, of properly understanding the research that's in front of them. And I figured it would be lovely to get you on to talk about that, as that's the bread and butter of what you do and what you have done for the last years. So I think all that to say, or to give a sort of brief introduction to the topic we're going to cover, what is it that you find also as a lecturer, the common pitfalls that people make when looking at research, and then we'll sort of break those ones down bit by bit, one by one?
Yeah, funny enough, we had a teach and learn event last week at the university, and one of the topics we sort of discussed with the staff is the fact students don't read anymore. It sounds stupid, doesn't it? You come to a university as an academic, and it's true. When I started as a student in 2006, a long time ago now, it's very much different than it is today in terms of both what we read and also how we read it as well, the medium that we use. So thinking back to my first year at John Moores University in Liverpool, to read the journal, you'd have to physically get the book off the shelf, the journal, go to the photocopier, pay 2p or whatever it was back then, and print the actual thing off. So by the time you've done all that, it took you 10, 15 minutes. you kind of felt like you had to read it because it's
You've
there. You've put
invested
all
into it. Yeah.
you've invested in, so you kind of followed up on what you intended to do. Whereas now, obviously, we just click a button, PDF will be downloaded in seconds, and then half the time it's the same, not just with students but with senior people as well. It'll just sit on our laptops and we probably don't read them. So I think the way in which we actually digest information has also changed as well. Obviously, podcasts like this one, infographics is also a big one that's popped up in sports science and the physio world the last few years.
Oh,
So
absolutely. Yeah.
so I do think, for a student now to sit down and spend a good hour with a nice study with a cup of coffee is actually quite rare. And I think that's actually the bigger challenge the next 5, 10 years, is to almost transition back to that rather than being, the cop out way, which is just look at the fancy infographic and take for what it is.
Yeah. And it's like you mentioned there, it's not just the students, it's also the senior people, myself included in that, in terms of working professionals, my colleagues as well, that you know, we look at a paper, we skim the abstract, think we know what that means, and then we'll just run with that, whether it flies in the face of something that we've done forever and want to stay up to date. So we go, okay, we're never going to do that specific treatment again, or whatever it might be. So one of the first things that you mentioned in that post was don't stop at the abstract. And yet what we're taught in our bachelor's, in a master's, in your PhD is the abstract is a thing that you write, which contains all the important information. I've had discussions with people and pointed them at specific papers where they told me the information I said was in that paper clearly isn't there because it's not in the abstract. And it was as silly as telling them to press Control F, type in the thing that I'm talking about, and you're going to find it in the paper. But yeah, why is it that we shouldn't stop at the abstract, even though we're told that should cover the paper?
Yeah, I guess a research paper is like a movie in a sense. So you go to the cinema, you watch. Well, if you're out a bit earlier, you'd watch the trailers of the upcoming films, and there's usually one that hooks you in, and you think, God, that looks great. That, and then you go a few weeks later, and it's absolutely diabolical, and you think, why the hell did I pay my money for that? And it's exactly the same with research papers, and that's what an abstract is. It's a brief trailer of what that study is, and I think that's one thing I've noticed the last few years, is because there's this almost competition to create positive findings and big storylines. Authors do almost amp up what they're actually reporting. And as I said on the post the other day, it's then a case of, well, once you delve into that, in terms of the methodology and the results of it, you look at the abstract and you compare and you think to yourself, well, actually those two things don't quite mirror up. And I think that's probably where people just read the abstract, they then go away and then even maybe implement it in the practice or shout about it on LinkedIn, whatever it might be. And that's, for me, quite a big issue.
Yeah. And you mentioned something there, in people want to get stuff published that's positive. So there's that inherent publication bias that happens as well, and is often reflected within the abstracts of papers as people are putting them through for publication, and it might get rejected, or hopefully it will get picked up and published. Can you maybe talk to us a little bit about that? As you've got over 30 odd papers that you got your name on. How does that go, and how does that work for people to get a bit of an understanding as to what the process is behind that?
Yeah, to be honest, it's a bit of a political world, the sort of game of publishing now, and I've been doing it for about 10 years now and had some good success, but also had equally as many rejections and turned downs in that time. So it can be a frustrating one for a researcher, and there does seem to be, in my opinion, a bias towards those sort of positive findings. So you could have put together a really nice controlled study, nice sample size, everything that sort of ticks the boxes. Once you get your findings, maybe it took you weeks or months in the lab. Absolutely nothing is found, no effect, and that's what it is. That's how, what you got to report. But you show that to a journal, it's not sexy. It doesn't really make a headline. and then suddenly you find negative reviews, or not even to reach the peer review stage. So it can be a little bit frustrating. That's not to say all journals do that. But I have noticed the last few years certain journals, and I won't name them on this podcast, have sort of try to push certain agendas or certain researchers' discussion points for whatever reasons I don't know. So there can be that sort of bias towards certain stories, I guess, is the way to put it.
Yeah, and I wouldn't push you to say any journal names, as you still want to get published at the end of the day. Don't bite the hand that feeds you.
I'm already blacklisted from about 10, so yeah, I don't need any more.
There is that. Oh god, I'm sure that'll be a discussion over a beer sometime if I ever see you. But so we've spoken about looking at the abstract, and it only gives you the trailer for the actual paper. So then when we're diving into a paper, what is it that we should be looking for to see if this paper is going to be of any value to us, then, if this paper is going to be of any use to us?
Yeah, I think the abstract's still useful in that regard, because firstly, when I have a weekly sort of scroll through PubMed to see what's the latest in my sort of area, so I narrow it down to my sort of field searches, and I'll use the abstract to kind of get to that first stage of thinking, oh, is this study of interest to me? Is it relevant? So then once it's kind of ticked that box, I'll look to download the paper. But as you say, for people who don't do this a lot, it's all right for academics because that's our job. But if you're a physio or a sports scientist, you're pretty short on time as well to sit through and read papers. So I feel as though you do get better at doing this the more you do it, like anything in life, really. But my sort of go-to is start top to bottom, introduction, method, results, discussion. I know people who prefer to do it the other way around and almost flip it and reverse the way they read things. That's fine. But for me, you always start off with that research question. So typically the last paragraph of an introduction talks about the study rationale, aims and objectives, and maybe a hypothesis if it's that sort of study. So to me, everything else, the methods, the results, the discussion, all has to come back to that initial research question. And to be honest, that's where a lot of studies can fall down, because you can tell the ones that have actually thought about, the design and actually took care of the data collection versus those who, might work in a football club and they've just got a season's worth of data by chance and they go, oh, let's produce a study. And it happens all the time. So for me, that's kind of the difference in quality. And as you say, I mean, the methods, it should be, I could go on all day about methods, but it should obviously be tightly controlled the best we can. If you work in the applied sense, it can be difficult because of the fact sometimes things just happen and that's the way it is. But I think I mentioned in the post as well about sort of study limitations and the fact we do gloss over that quite a lot. So I've read studies on, say, use of GPS in injury. So people might have done like a season's worth of data and blown it all up, fantastic findings, this metric does this, blah, blah, blah. Right at the bottom, limitations, we were missing 40% of our data through error or, device not turning on, etc. And that's fine, they've reported it, so that's okay. At least they've admitted a limitation there. But then a lot of people just seem to then gloss over that and then take the result for what it is. We don't really, if it's a major limitation such as that, that's a big red flag for me. So I think we need to get better at, not just accepting everything for what it is. And it's that critique is something we always try and teach our students is, can you be critical and not just descriptive in terms of what it is?
It's a couple things there. One, I'm one of those people who goes back to front, so it's interesting to hear that. And I think, as you said it, my reasoning for it kind of became obvious in my own head to see what way the results go, even without knowing the research question fully at that point. I develop a picture in my head and then decide if it's worth going on with it. So it's nice to see my own issues kind of brought to the front there. Interesting. And then the other thing there that you said with limitations, I mean, something like a 40% gap in data, that's quite significant. And again, like you say, for that to just be glossed over, that could throw the results one way or the other, or completely neutral and give nothing out at all. How how is it that we can become more cognizant of this when we're looking at papers then?
I mean, most studies will limit, have a limitation section, and it's then on the reader to pick those up and kind of, make your own interpretation. So if it's, the classic one is always the sample size in applied studies. If you look at medical-based studies, we're talking hundreds and hundreds of, subjects, participants, whereas applied sports science studies, for example, you might get a sample of 20, typically a team or, an actual lab-based study. So we have to kind of accept what it is to an extent, but then another one might be something like the method you use. So in my sort of space, which is sort of technology, a lot of people don't detail reliability and validity of their equipment. It might be something brand new on the market, which is not really being explored yet, but they try and jump ahead and apply it and then use those findings rather than doing the early stuff, which is establishing how accurate is that particular measurement tool. So again, it's just looking at those things, and I do this as a journal reviewer as well, is just, can you improve your reporting and your methodology? And it's something that certain journals I'm involved in are doing a really good job of now. They're starting to really hit back at the authors and put it back on them to improve the way they report things. And for some people, they just don't have the answers to those, and you have to withdraw the paper, and that's how it is. And that's fine. It's improving science.
As frustrating as I'm sure that can be for those people when it is rejected on those grounds, I think that only, from my position at least, only improves the reliability and validity of the paper, as then it gives someone else externally the chance to really repeat that study and really repeat what's going on. Because if you don't know how accurate the machines are that you're working with, you could be shooting fish in a barrel trying to get the results and getting something completely the opposite if you do go and repeat it. And then what is it worth either way of either of those papers? There's no real justification for either of them at that point. And the reason for that could have been something as simple as not reporting the instrumentation limitations, essentially. So then that brings us back up to the methodology. What are the things that you're looking for there then further, other than have they reported limitations in the equipment? Have they got a sufficient sample size? And how can we work out what's a sufficient sample size as well to know if there's anything there? Because that also brings us to another question of clinically significant versus statistically significant findings as well, which is a whole other bag of worms. But first, with the methodology, what other things are there for us looking at it in applied settings that you think are worthwhile?
Yeah, I think you touched on sample size there, and as researchers, we're always told to, create power calculations with our sample size collection. So, I've done this in the past, and the issue sometimes, if the evidence isn't there to work out those calculations at the start, it can get a little bit tricky. And I've done them in the past, and we've split. When you've gone through the software and it spits out, oh, you need 250 people to make this a really well powered study, and you're like, great, that's fantastic, but I can't get that number of people. It's just not possible in the type of study that you're doing. So I do think you need to look at who you're doing it on. I think is a big one, because one thing we see a lot is, obviously we get studies on university students, and I've been involved in these studies myself, where you're trying to then create results and a story from that cohort all the way up to elite athletes, and it just isn't the case. It's completely different physiology and the way they work. So I think that's something to be aware of, is the type of participant and how many. We're probably never going to reach the same as a clinical trial and an applied study, but at least if you've got an n=4, clearly that's underpowered a lot of the time.
Yeah.
That being said, if you are working and studying with elites, we're now seeing more sort of like case study type stuff, which journals are accepting. But obviously that would be more on those top people, the n=1, but they are the best in that field, and it's still relevant information. And n=1 on a student who's been on a night out the night before and done some testing probably isn't relevant to what we're doing.
Fair enough. Yeah, it'd be quite difficult to get someone on a Douglas bag if they're still feeling last night's pint. Like,
just might be filled with Guinness. That's the only issue.
yeah, that would be interesting to see. I haven't seen that yet. But that's also something there with the whole n equals 1 bit and the sample size, and extrapolating that data up to from a cohort of 20 students to elite athletes. We do that all the time, whether it's in physiotherapy with low back pain guidelines or ACL rehab from on the bench out onto the field. And we take studies that have been done on the general population, let's say, and then apply that to elite athletes. Now, there are differences there. But even within the general population, something that's often missed is it's always n equals 1. It's that person in front of you might not be representative of the data set that you've just read. So that's also something that I think I find, at least in applying it in my daily practice of what's in the research, it has to be taken with a grain of salt. Unfortunately, that's just the way of the world, in that we can't just take a paper and apply that directly. There needs to be some color in between the lines a little bit, as it were. So then if we pull away from the methodology, you mentioned something else about looking at the statistics that they're using, and do the statistics line up with what their initial study set out to do? How can we marry these things up? And why is it that we need to be aware of this?
Yeah, probably the one area that, as a reviewer now, it's getting more and more complicated, to be honest, because again, when I started as a student, all we knew was p-value testing. It was pretty much ANOVAs, and that was it. And as the years have gone on, and there was a shift towards inferential statistics, and then now we've got the emergence of data science, which is adding a layer of insight. It's a good discipline to bring in, but at the same time, it's adding a big layer of complexity to the average reader. So, I'm a sports scientist by trade. I know a little bit about data science, but I'm not a data scientist. I know colleagues of mine who've actually retrained in order to be a data scientist, because obviously it's a quite big field to go into. But if you give me a paper to review which is just full of data science techniques, I'm not an expert in that. I'm going to have to refer that to someone who is. So that's probably the bigger issue now, is that we're getting this new wave of different type of statistics that, to be honest, the typical undergrad students would not understand. We're talking a completely different discipline, but also a different level of advanced stats. So for me, there is like an over complexity to it sometimes, and I've seen papers where they've got these really great statistics. So what happens, if I'm being honest, is a club might have some data. They'll then find a geeky maths wizard, sorry to stereotype right there, but they'll find someone who's obviously good in that department, give them the data, they work the magic like a wizard, they come back with all these fancy stats and then plop it in the paper, and that's it. But when you read the paper, it doesn't flow. It doesn't quite match up, because you've got quite a basic intro method, really heavy stats in the results, and then a brief discussion at the end. And it's kind of, the weighting of the paper is wrong. So the problem with that is sometimes the stats they use, it isn't really adding to the study, because the methodology itself is still the same. It's still basic. Just because the stats are fancier doesn't make it a better study, because what you've actually investigated might just be basic anyway.
It's really funny that you mentioned throwing in a whole bunch of fancy stats, as that reminds me of a group project we had to do in my undergrad, and the chap who was responsible for the results section did exactly that. Had no idea what he was adding in or why, but just threw everything at it. And when our lecturer reviewed the paper, it just had nothing for the results other than, we need to have a chat, lads, because of the fact that like you say, there's a whole bunch of stuff there. It looks fantastic, but it's just not relevant. It's just not something that you needed to work with, you can work with, or you can apply. Uh, and like you say, students or working professionals, if your colleagues who are in the field and conducting research as their bread and butter are having to retrain to fully understand the statistics, I'm going to be screwed looking at it, let alone, someone else who maybe doesn't pick up a research paper as often. Um, uh, if that's the case and things are shifting that way, what is it that we can do as readers to get a better grasp? I've had someone once say before, you just have to stop the paper at that point, Google those things, and then come back to it once you're familiar. But then, like you say, people don't have 15 minutes anymore to sit with a cup of coffee and read a paper, let alone going away to get some deeper background info. What can we do to better understand it?
To be honest, yeah, I think there is an issue where Google does come into play, and I'm the same, if I'm being honest. But sometimes when I read these different, machine learning techniques, etc., I've never even heard of half of them. So there is a little bit of that, but also I think my sort of approach is you look at the methods, you look at the statistical analysis part, and see what is it they've actually done before you start to see all the fancy graphs, etc. What is it they've actually tried to do? And a lot of the time you can get the grip, the grasp of it from that section in terms of the type of stats that they're trying to run on the data. And then a lot of the time, to be honest, I would go straight to the tables or the figures as my first protocol to see, what's the trends in the data? How's it look? Is it statistically different? Because that's still, for me, the most important part. Is it different from your control group, or is it different from your, experimental group? So that's still the bread and butter. It's then when you start getting into all these fancy plots and things like that, it takes a bit more, right? Let's Google this, let's see what this is all about. And as you say, you shouldn't have to retrain. But we can't be naive enough to think the stats of 15 years ago are what we should be teaching our students now as well.
There. And then you mentioned something there as well when you go to review the results, looking at if it's statistically significant. And this is something that I mentioned prior as well, clinically significant versus statistically significant. Can you maybe give us a brief overview of the two? And then maybe we can talk a little bit about why a research paper, although it might show something statistically significant, it might not be clinically significant, or even the other way around, and what inferences that has for us when applying it to the field.
Yeah, I think p value testing has been bashed around, particularly the last decade. It seems to have just, I don't know, people trying to eradicate it completely. And for me, I'm still a big fan of it, to be honest, personally, because okay, I get the frustration of if you're 0.06 versus your threshold, it's pretty much significant, but then it's not. I understand that frustration, but certainly some of the other stats that are around, you can, to use a better phrase, you can basically polish a turd, can't you? You can find a way to make your data look good, or I use the word significance loosely within your data set. So something like a p-value, it's yes or a no, isn't it? Okay, it's frustrating because it can, like say, that clinical difference or practical difference, it might not always get to that point, but at least it's testing something. At least it's testing the hypotheses, or it's comparing one to the other. Whereas some of these looser stats that, again, they've had criticism the last few years. A lot of people switch towards the Will Hopkins approach and all that sort of stuff, and people are now realizing, actually, is it as strong as we once thought? So there's no right or wrong in this. There's no simple way to do stats, but I do think the interpretation, it needs to have that clear yes or no, ideally. But probably going off on tangent a little bit, a lot of the best research is probably done in house, to be honest, and it's not actually published. And like we said before, they're the ones with the small sample sizes, but the best people to do it on. And a lot of the time, people will just, I've seen it done, like just do an average. Here's the data. They won't run any stats on it whatsoever. And there are stats you can still do even with low sample sizes. So I think the more of that stuff we can get out would be fantastic, as opposed to some of these other studies with students where you got fancy stats and you got this, but the practical application is actually not great.
Okay. Um, that's it. It's interesting in the sense that it's essentially taking a less is more approach then in that case. You don't, like you say, don't need the fancy stuff. You don't necessarily need to overanalyze the data. But if you have a decent set, you can still do something with it, right?
Yeah, I mean, maybe call me old school. I'm still a fan of a simple figure and a simple table with some stars next to them indicating significance. To me, that's still the bread and butter of what we do. And it's not to say,
Yeah.
some of the data science is not applicable, particularly with these larger data sets now and, in the field of injury, and everyone wants the holy grail of injury prediction, which to be honest, I don't think anyone will ever come to that point. I don't think you can accurately predict an injury, but you can maybe, determine risk factors based off some of these machine learning techniques, for example. So there is a place for that type of statistics, but it depends on the study, and it certainly can't be shoehorned into every study that we do in sports science.
Fair. Coming back to the p-value stuff though, it is something that can be manipulated though, right? You can formulate your research to get the outcome that you need essentially and get the p-values that are needed. And there are some instances where things might not be clinically significant, but a study is designed in such a way to get that statistical significance there because, like you've already mentioned, it dresses it up nicely. It makes it a little bit more sexy in order to get published. So I think what I'm getting at is when we're reading the paper, how is it that we can discern whether or not this paper is just something that sounds quite derogatory when I say just a paper, but it's a paper that's more designed for the statistical significance than it is looking at any clinical application. How can we pick up a paper and say, right, it looks great, looks fantastic, but applying this in clinic isn't actually going to be any use, or applying this on the field isn't actually going to do us any favors?
Yeah, I think it comes back again to looking at the raw data as well in the tables and the figures. Like I say, that's why I always start there, to be honest, because there was a paper recently, I forget which journal, might have been a nutrition one, where they'd taken a supplement, it might be in the black currant supplement or something like this, and it improved the O2 max by like 50-60% or something stupid like that in this study.
Jesus.
And it got all the way through. It got published, and it was there in peer review and publication. And then someone looked at the data, was like, "Hang on, that's ridiculous. Like that's like beyond physiologically possible." So obviously, then someone raised it, letter to the editor, and it obviously led to investigation, and that paper was subsequently retracted from the journal. But all it would have took was a reviewer or a person to actually look at those raw numbers and think, hang on, that looks a bit dodgy. What's going on here? That improvement's so much, even though if you just looked at the significance, it would just say P less than 0.05 or wherever it might be. So I think it is a combination of the two. And, practitioners know, looking at certain tests and certain data, what's the right figures, or what's the expectation, and what's the trends that you would look for, as well as the, statistical testing itself.
Okay. So I think in that sense, it's more so a case of the more you read, the more you'll be aware of it, kind of thing, to understand those expectations, because it's not something you're going to gain fresh out of the bat from your undergrads or your masters necessarily. It's something that you gain through exposure to the different papers, exposure to seeing the way that the trends go. But that then brings us on to something else there that you mentioned, the reviewers. And it's something that I've had a bit of a bee in my bonnet about for the last couple of years, especially in that you mentioned there in that paper, if someone looks at the raw data, then they would have seen 2 and 2 isn't making 4 here. But peer reviewers in that instance may have dropped the ball. But there is something to be said that you don't always get all the data as a peer reviewer. You're a peer reviewer. That's one of the things that you do. It's also something that peer reviewers have to do voluntarily. You're not paid to do it. So it's a noble endeavor. But at the same time, if you're not getting the raw data, you can't fully break down the paper. You almost have to proofread it in a way.
Yeah, I think peer review, I mean, I could rant all day myself about peer review, and we'll only briefly touch on it. I mean, one point just to note as well is there's trying to this push towards open science at the moment, which I do think is a great idea. So certain journals now will accept what they call registered reports. So you almost before you do a study, you're basically registering your methods and your intended outcomes, etc. So you, rather than this situation I mentioned before of people, oh, I've got some data, let's make a study. It's to avoid those sorts of pitfalls because you're actually thinking about what you're doing beforehand. But at the same time, once the data is there and it's published, there's certain websites now where you can upload that and that's freely available to everyone. Certain journals are definitely encouraging the sharing of data as well as part of that submission process. So at the moment, you don't have to for most journals, but it would certainly help. But I think just to come back to peer review, the main issue we've got right now is there's just the numbers don't match up in terms of the number of submissions versus availability of reviewers and good reviewers. The main reason for that is the fact there's just too many journals now. You know, like I say, I could go off on a rant all day about the fact that the money they make, etc., the publishers, but you know, authors need publishers to publish the work, and publishers need authors to produce the goods to sell. So it's always going to be that way. But the problem now, you've got your open access journals where there's you know, they're paying $2,000-3,000 pounds to publish a paper in a certain journal.
Jeez.
There's argument to say, is the review process as stringent in those journals? I'm not, you know, accusing anyone of anything, but you know, if you're paying money to publish versus not, then maybe that's a factor.
It's a bit of a leg up at least.
Surely. But then also, you know, if you go to say a well-known professor in the field, can you review this paper? Professors are busy people. They'll probably move that down to one of their grad students. You know, has that grad student done peer review before? Maybe, maybe not. Are they going to get the same quality? And that's probably the big downfall, is that consistency. You know, if I accept the paper to review, I'll spend probably a good 45 to an hour of my time on it for free, as we mentioned, voluntary, to do a thorough job on the paper. Whereas, you know, I've submitted papers and I've got one line back, usually not very nice, but you know, just one line.
This was shit. No.
Yeah, pretty much just straight to the point, mate. Yeah, nice one. Or you might get someone who's literally provided about 5 pages worth of comments that improve the paper as well, because that's what peer review should be. It's not just to say if it's good or bad, it's to actually, can you improve the manuscript for publication? So it's that variety, and that's the issue. I used the example before of that study that got retracted, but that quality control is, can we get enough good peer reviewers to be in the system? At the moment, the answer is no. It's just too vast. There's just too many journals to cover.
This thing with open science that you mentioned, one of the places that I've seen a lot of research going on to more recently is ResearchGate, and there's a couple papers that have done the rounds there, and they've been viewed by thousands, if not tens of thousands of people, and that in and of itself kind of acts as a form of peer review right there, because much like what happened with this paper, it was a reader, someone who was picking this paper up at a later stage, who said, guys, this doesn't make sense, pass it back up to the editor, goes back to the author, and then it gets pulled from publication, or potentially they have XYZ reasoning, whatever it might be. So for me, that makes a lot more sense, but it also potentially leaves a lot more room for bad data to come through potentially as well, right?
Yeah, I do think the open access stuff, it does cause a lot of problems, and it's just that sheer volume. You know, like I say, I get the alerts through, and I will look for certain journals I trust more than others. To be honest, I do have a bias towards a certain journal, but that being said, there's some good open access journals out there with some good stuff in it. But you know, some of the stuff you see straight away, you read the abstract, or even even the title, and you just think, this is no good. It's just another person who's gone, right, I need another paper for me CV. I'm just going to publish this data, and it sounds cynical, but it is a numbers game for people, especially in academia. It's about who publishes the most and most often, make a name for yourself. So yeah, I do think the open access thing, it's a big cause of the problems. ResearchGate's fantastic because at least then you're not so much restricted by the paywall barrier. You can put a plain Word version up of your manuscript for people to comment and share, etc. So that helps us as researchers too, because it's like my institution where I work, we can't all afford the publisher subscriptions. It's a big money world. And then if no one reads your research, then what's the point in doing it? So we do need that openness, but at the moment, the model, it costs money, and most people can't afford it.
Yeah, and that's another thing as well. You've already mentioned the fact that people might pay 2,000-3,000 to get their article manuscript published, and this goes to the journal company, but none of that is then seen by the researchers at all. This is all for the journals, for their advertising budget, for their printing budget, or whatever else it might be. Again, not to sound overly cynical, but yeah, if it's not going to the researchers, if it's not going to the people who are putting in the good work, it also raises some questions for myself as well. But coming back down a level to the studies, one of the reasons that you mentioned while we were talking before the mics went hot was for making that post was on the whole ice baths and cold water immersion and its effects on adaptation. Can you maybe talk to us a little bit about that? Because I think at the moment, the conversation that we've had is quite nebulous. There's nothing really to pin the tail on any kind of donkey. But then if we bring it back down to the cold water immersion stuff, it makes it a little bit more tangible to the listeners in the sense that, what do we mean when we say all these different things?
Yeah, so that's probably what triggered the original post I put on LinkedIn, was the fact I'd seen a guy, I can't remember his name, tweeted on Twitter and put about the fact ice baths were totally negative and bad for your performance and adaptation. And kind of posted images. So he posted an image of a single study which was published in the Journal of Physiology. So quite a heavy sort of molecular, pure physiology journal. Those sort of journals, fantastic for science, but usually a long way along the continuum as to the practical side. It's usually something very mechanistic, which is good and interesting, but then we have to move that along the line to see what's the practical outcome. So basically, this post got about 3,000 likes, a load of retweets, etc. And myself and a couple of colleagues who've been researching in this area, it was a bit frustrating because people will see something like that and go, "Oh, ice baths are bad. Let's stop using them straight away. Let's turn the tap off. Let's get out of there." And that's not the case. Yeah, there are some studies that show negative connotations with ice baths, and particularly with resistance training to some degree. But when you look at the body of research as a whole, it's not strong enough to go to that conclusion. So for me, again, this is a big issue. What practitioners need to kind of hone in on is, don't just take a single study's findings and take that as a whole. This is the reason we have systematic reviews and meta-analyses to pool that information together to then make more informed decisions about what we're doing. So, to take an example of the use of creatine in sports, something that's been widely researched, but arguably the most researched supplement that we've seen. And it's quite equivocal in terms of the findings. It's good. It improves strength, power, parts of endurance, size, all the good stuff that we need in sport. But then if you've got something new, whether that's new technology or a new supplement, wherever it might be, you need to build that body of evidence over time. And this is where we get, I guess, the trade-off, don't we, between the research and what goes on practically. If you've got a new bit of kit, or as you say, a new drink that you're trying out from a company, peer review is slow. It takes such a long time to get published. So by the time you've got your study through the gates and out into the world, that could be 9 month process. And in that time, someone's been using that drink or that technology for 9 months in the field. And this is always the issue, is we're always catching up in terms of published peer review literature versus what actually happens in the field, and whether
Mm.
that be, clinically, or whether that be in sports science. So can we improve that process? Maybe, but as we said before, the big issue is just the sheer volume of submissions and the number of journals that we're submitting to now.
One of the big things there that you mentioned is look at the body of the literature. However, even with that, sometimes we also need to be cognizant of the meta-analysis or the systematic review in looking at the studies that they've then used in order to come to their conclusions and come to their findings, because there are a couple that I've read that when you look at the studies that they've used, in some instances, although the overarching topic is the same, they're almost comparing apples to oranges when you're looking at populations that they may have used, when you're looking at the interventions that they may have used. So there's also something there as well. Even when the meta-analysis is out, there still needs to be an eye of scrutiny of the reader when looking at it, right?
Yeah, very, very important point. And to use that example with the cold water, so I did post about the recent meta-analyses with the strength adaptation stuff. And again, by the time you've gone through the quality control, it whittled it down to about 10 or 11 studies. And of those studies, the variance in protocol was vast. Some people, did certain types of outcome measures. So it might be IKD, or it might be 1 rep max in the gym. Others have done obviously different durations of immersion as well. So there's variance there. But interestingly, the rough trend that we did find was the ones who only immersed in like a single limb, or say just your legs or just your arms. They were the studies that found a trend towards the negative effects of adaptation. Whereas those who did the more common practical method, which is up to the sternum, sitting in a bath up to your sternum, they're the ones who found minimal or no effect whatsoever in terms of adaptation. So that was quite interesting for that
Yeah.
meta-analysis, because that was something that most people wouldn't pick up on. But like you say, I think it is important, we don't just take and think every study's got the same protocol, because it hasn't. It's impossible nearly. But we need to then factor that into the interpretation of what we're finding there.
No, absolutely. And you know, to say we need to weight the studies differently kind of gives them an air of importance. It's not weighting the study in terms of importance. It's more weighting the study, as like you say, in terms of its relevance and its applicability in the respective fields that you're looking at, right? As I I don't know anyone of anyone that I know that does ice baths, cold water immersion, that just does one limb at a time. I maybe you've seen differently in the sports world. You see some crazy stuff, I imagine, but I'm yet to find someone that does that. However, if, like you say, the findings were quite consistent, of almost no effect with up to the sternum, that paints a completely different picture. Uh, so again, it's don't stop at an abstract and keep reading, and read more to be able to discern what's relevant to you. So in a way, although I was hoping that this conversation would almost create a checklist, that I know there are checklists out there to look at papers and to review papers for people to be aware of. If anything, it's kind of made the list of things that you need to do a little bit longer, and you know, have a better eye for what you're looking at. But at the end of the day, I don't think that's a bad outcome if it means that you're going to be a little bit better informed with the things that you're picking up, right?
Yeah, and it comes back to the point we said earlier about, how much time do you really have in a week to read papers? And, I've worked in football and things where you've got barely enough time to see your family, let alone read a bloody research paper or have a pint in the pub. So I think infographics, etc., podcasts are still very, very good ways to pick up good information. It's not to belittle the role of those things. It's just to make sure you've got that quality control, and that's why sport and organisations will link with universities. So people like myself who would have more time to do that sort of thing, we can do that for you, and then just give you the end bottom line. This study was good. This is what we found. And it's something, if I'm being honest, I'm looking to launch a bit of a platform maybe the next few months, sort of like a research club, I'd like to call it, where it's a private Slack channel where we're sharing information and studies, and basically taking a lot of the legwork out of sitting down and reading papers ourselves.
In essence, it becomes community review in that sense, its own sort of journal club, book club. But yeah.
Yeah, and it's something we used to do in the clubs as well. We used to have a weekly or bi-weekly journal club. Sounds a bit sad, doesn't it? But we'd each take a turn and
Has to be done. Yeah.
share a paper over a coffee, and it was quite useful because one of us would do the heavy lifting, the others would look through it, but then we'd have a nice little roundtable discussion about the research, how we could apply it in practice as well. So things like that, I think, are really good to drip into your weekly practice, but there's no chance, unless you're studying for a PhD or a prof doc, etc., to sit down 2-3 hours a day reading papers. It's just not practical.
No, not at all. And like you've already mentioned, the sheer volume of things coming out or for review, and the sheer volume of things coming out in publication, it's a full-time job, and no one's getting paid to sit there and just read papers. Like, it really is a full-time job if you want to stay on top of absolutely everything that comes out. But with that said, are there any last little tidbits that you'd like to leave the listeners with? Any top tips?
Yeah, I guess top tips. I mean, it gets easier over time. I think when you read papers, for example, if I read a paper now, my area in football, for example, pretty much every introduction is written the same. When I read through, that's no disrespect to anyone, but there's only so much you can say about football and what it is. So I can almost skip the first few paragraphs because I know what they're going to say, and then get into the crux of the study straight away. So that would save me 10-15 minutes of reading straight off the bat. So probably the first bit is it does get easier the more you do it, like anything in life. And certainly look out for the key things we spoke about today. What's the rationale? How good are the methods? Is there any major limitations there? Read through the crazy stats that are out there now and see exactly what it is they're trying to answer. And in that discussion, have they actually summarized it well? If the bit I always like is, what's the future? We've done this, okay, what's next? And that for me is always the exciting bit, is, as we said, science is always trying to answer new questions and what we're doing.
Where can people find you if they want to either find out more about this sort of stuff, or find out more about what you're up to as well? And as I've already mentioned, I read a lot of your posts as well as of late. So
Yeah, probably the best place is on LinkedIn, to be honest. I kind of made it a little bit of a mission a few months ago to post every day. So I'm just about managing to keep up with that, my workload at the moment. So yeah, my profile's James Malone 23, or just search my name in the bar. Like say, give me a follow, give me a connection, and drop me a DM, and we can always have a chat or a call about anything.
Oh, lovely. Thank you very much. Look, James, I really, really appreciate your time. Appreciate being able to sit down with us, and enjoy the rest of your day.
Yeah, cheers, Sonny. Thanks very much.
Well, ladies and gents, thanks again for listening in, and we'll catch you next time. As always, wherever you're listening to this, we appreciate your time, and if you have any comments or suggestions, feel free to get in contact and let us know. Until next time, peace.